Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another installment of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. My name is Frank Guridy. I'm the author of, most recently, The Sports Revolution, How Texas Changed the Culture of American Athletics, which was published last year. And I'm super excited to have the opportunity to talk today to Clayton Trutor, the author of Loserville, How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports, published by the University of Nebraska Press earlier this year. Clayton, how are you today?
Doing great, Frank. Thanks so much for taking the time to look at the book and also to talk to me about it.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating book, and I'm going to tell you part of the reason why it caught my eye. I happened to have been in Atlanta on the day that the Braves Major League Baseball franchise announced their intent to build a new stadium in suburban Cobb County in 2013. Wow. And I remember thinking, I just happened to be there. I was on a visit, and I remember thinking at the time that, there's probably a fascinating history behind this headline. And I kind of knew the outlines of it a little bit, right? But given Atlanta's fascinating history, its history in the terms of the history of Jim Crow segregation, the history of the civil rights movement, among other reasons why Atlanta's history, is interesting. I also figured that there probably has an interesting sport history, and I thought, geez, somebody should do that. And lo and behold, that's what you've done with this amazing book.
That's roughly when I was getting my dissertation going, which eventually evolved into the book.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So let's start off just with the kind of the standard question. How did this book come about? You seem to have an uncommon deep knowledge of Atlanta sports and Atlanta metropolitan history, right? I mean, this is a book that takes you from, Ivan Allen's era, when he's the mayor of Atlanta, to the intricacies of the Braves 1975, failings on the field. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating detail here, in which you move between the kind of political, social history of the city and the metropolitan area with, an in-depth knowledge of the professional sports franchise that you talk about. So tell us about how this book came about.
Well, thank you for the kind words. It started in graduate school. I'm a historian of American cities. As I was looking around for a dissertation topic, I somehow wanted to involve sports. I'm a lifelong sports fan. It struck me that there was some kind of a story to tell. Initially, I had the idea that I wanted to write about the history of franchise relocations in a broad North American sense of the term. My advisor, Lynn Johnson at Boston College, very reasonably advised me that would take me 50 years to do. Pick a particular city, focus in on that, one that's emblematic of the shifts you want to discuss. And Atlanta ended up emerging from this. In many ways, Atlanta serves a pioneering role in shaping the way that cities tried to pursue pro sports, and also the response that many cities in the South and West in particular faced as they got a glut of pro franchises very quickly.
Yeah. And so, so you're working with, as I did in my book, this notion of the Sun Belt, right? And you're locating in similar ways, I was locating places like Houston and Dallas in that story of post-World War II kind of sport and urban development and sport and politics. So, how did you say more about, Atlanta itself? I mean, so it was a case study that was, ripe for analysis, and you're, as I said, and you're exactly right about that. But what else might have been about Atlanta that drew you to the case?
I think in some ways it was the civic leadership as much as anything. Mm-hmm. They so clearly had the idea that they wanted to be a major league town. I think when you compare Atlanta's pursuit of pro sports to even cities like Houston, like New Orleans, they were very focused on building a major structure, the Astrodome, the Louisiana Superdome, that the building itself would be a source of prestige for the community. Atlanta seemed more interested in the amenity of having a pro sports team in the same way they'd be interested in having a ballet or an art museum, that it was an outward sign to the rest of the world that this was a city worthy of prestige comparable to the economic status it had developed in the decades since World War II. So I think Atlanta's fixation simply with getting teams is what interested me so much as a civic luxury.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think you make this point very clearly, and there are some interesting parallels with the cities we've talked about in Texas, but in general, in terms of how elites are looking in the post-World War II period, right? How they're looking to, sports franchises and sports institutions as a way to put their cities on the map, as a way to kind of, even at that time, generate, sort of economic development, although that becomes more of a bigger argument, I think, in subsequent decades. And yet there's some particularities. And I think your book brings out the particularities of this Atlanta case in a very interesting way, in a way that in some, in my view, particularly around questions of race, which I want to talk about later, which really offers a kind of nuanced reading of the ways in which African Americans get entangled in some of these projects, even as supporters of them, right? Even projects that, are you would think on one level are sort of against their community interests, but, that's something I want to hold off on in a minute. But let's say more about the narrative and the argument of this book. So, you're interested in the ways in which civic elites are looking to sports institutions, sports franchise, professionals, right? We're talking about here. But this is not a book about sport bringing community together. It's not really a book about successful sports franchises on or off the field. This is a weighty book about futility, isn't it? Right? Your book argues that civic elites' vision of professional sports in Atlanta did not bring communities together, right? And it did not become durable institutions, even though they lasted, these franchises, at least some of them, to the present. And in fact, I think I see you arguing that the Atlanta case shows how fans were largely disinterested in this vision, right? You argue that fans in Atlanta responded to the arrival of pro sports teams with a, your words, collective shrug, right? And your analysis of the attendance figures, of the Braves, the Falcons, the Flames to a lesser extent, and the Hawks, bears that out, right? So how did you arrive at this argument? You would think this is an argument that's going to, show how some of these visions succeeded. And in some ways, maybe in the long run, you could say they did, but certainly in the period that you're looking at, which is roughly 1965 to 1975, clearly, following the news articles that you wrote about in that period, Atlanta is really much is a Loserville town. So, how did you arrive at this argument?
Well, in many, that certainly is the argument of the book. It's a story of grand aspirations which don't play out as anticipated. In many other cities, San Diego, Jacksonville, certainly found similar situations. Phoenix certainly too. But I think as much as anything, I found it from the people who lived through it themselves, whether it was talking to people at the individual level, whether it was the original Loserville columns by Louis Grizzard, which inspired this, that the media of Atlanta couldn't have been bigger boosters of the idea of becoming major league in the mid 1960s, but they eventually take a very aloof posture towards the teams, not wanting to be associated with their losing, with the blasé attitude people had taken locally with them. The idea is that it would rub off on them. So there became a very calculated posture very quickly in Atlanta among, I guess, the media and I guess more broadly civic elites toward these teams, that one generation had so clearly embraced them, but it became something that had been accomplished, something that seemed like it was in the past very quickly. I think even in the Olympic generation in Atlanta in the early 90s, you see this, that we did this thing in the past, that was a long time ago. We have our own aspiration we're going to make Atlanta the next great international city. And Atlanta succeeds at this. It's a very short-term kind of thing. Atlanta seems right now to be in the midst of a third generation of this with the new stadium building the stadium out in the suburbs, building Mercedes-Benz Stadium just south of downtown as well. That every generation wants to have these grand projects, and they don't necessarily prove to be as durable successes as intended. I think broadly speaking, there's an idealism to each generation of civic leadership in town that they will be these grand unifiers. Dating back to the 1960s, I think there's an aspect too that Atlanta was clearly the most progressive city in the South. It's being surrounded by Jim Crow Georgia. There's this idea it's going to bring suburbs and city together, going to bring cross racial lines and bring people together, bring the many transplants to the region together with locals. And it didn't really quite happen that way. I would say, if anything, this is a story of people staying within, as much as anything, I would almost call it lifestyle clusters, that people had particular ways of spending their leisure time, and they showed great agency in terms of that. From a broad range of demographics, that they continued to be interested in the things they were interested in before the big leagues got there. Because there were suddenly teams with Atlanta across their chest didn't mean you were going to give up on primarily being interested in golf or boating, primarily being interested in professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. Whatever way you chose to spend your discretionary income and your free time, many people continued to do so generation after generation, in spite of Atlanta being a big league team. I think if you look at a lot of northeastern cities with long histories in pro sports, there's this whole, my dad took me to a game and his dad took me to a game. These are long tenured local institutions. 50 years on, Atlanta's teams still seem like a consumer product, like any other way someone would choose to spend their free time in the city. And it seems like that's the case around a lot of the Sun Belt. Just looking at some kind of examples, I sort of see that in Phoenix. I sort of see that in San Diego too. That the teams didn't become what the civic leaders had anticipated them back in the 60s and 70s when they put such effort into pursuing them.
effort in public resources and public dollars,
Mhm.
right, in the form of stadium subsidies
Absolutely.
for sure. So yeah, let's talk about more about the kind of the structural conditions that lead to, I love the phrase, the collective shrug of the Atlanta fan base. So I see you on the one hand highlighting the failures of the particular management of the particular franchises, right? I
Mhm.
mean, this certainly comes through in your discussion of the Falcons under the initial ownership there, the Hawks to a lesser extent. The fact that these teams, certainly the Braves, are mediocre at best. They have that 1969 NL West pennant, year, but then they're pretty much mediocre, even with the great Hank Aaron, hitting home runs all the time for the Braves. So that, part of the disinterest is that the teams aren't doing well, right? And certainly the Falcons and the Braves weren't. Then the Hawks, kind of were middling, and then you have the Flames case, which is also interesting. But I mean, you're also interested in these kind of structural things that prevented Atlanta Stadium from becoming this anchor that Allen and so many of the civic leaders envisioned, or even the Omni, right? And you come to this at a number of points in the book, but in particular in chapter 14 in your discussion of the politics of metropolitan divergence. Now, there's a really interesting analysis of racial, regional, metropolitan politics in Atlanta, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that and that factor, right? The role that had in preventing this kind of cohesion that the civic elites imagined that sports would have.
Yeah, absolutely. Every other political, cultural, and social force in the region was tending toward divergence in this particular time period. You had the twin assertion of a predominantly white suburban politics, which is aiming towards separation from all things urban, towards continued de facto segregation in many different respects. At the same time, you have as Atlanta becomes a majority black city in the early 1970s, you have a greater assertion of black political power, which had been part of the city's political leadership since the 1940s, since there'd been a broad expansion of the black electorate in Atlanta. Had been very pragmatically a part of this biracial governing coalition, getting little gains here, little gains there in different matters. But eventually, with the election of Maynard Jackson as mayor in 1973, you see a political transformation in the sense of a more explicit black electoral politics in the city, and you see these divisions end up shaping virtually every political matter in the community, whether in the region, whether it's mass transit, whether it's housing issues, whether it's talk about merging Atlanta with some of its suburbs into a broader city. You have two distinct power bases that do not want to give up any of the recently accrued power, and that seeking out a stadium, seeking out pro sports as the civic unifier that's going to bring all these different moving parts together, it just wasn't a time period particularly suited toward this. Certainly the teams were bad, certainly the region is spread out, but there's a lot of other forces happening in the region which are pulling apart at the idea of having some kind of source of civic unity, which is interesting in Atlanta because the politics of the post-war era, the governing coalition, which had combined essentially the white professional class with virtually all black voters in the city, was the electoral base. That had been built very much around Atlanta being this city too busy to hate, as Mayor Hartsfield coined the term. But that certainly starts to fracture during this time period. Certainly, there's still a tendency in Atlanta in I would say, the 70s and more so in the 80s under Andrew Young, that there's a pragmatism among the city's black political leadership. You have to deal with these corporate leaders, even if they want to essentially move out to the suburbs, simply for the material benefits of your core constituency. But at the same time, there are all these forces pulling apart within the region as well.
Yeah, I mean, and so I mean, you're mapping that out very clearly in this period. But of course, this was a Jim Crow city, right? So I mean, it was already had its fragmentation, right? I mean, that's the fascinating aspect of Atlanta, right? Like it has this reputation of being too busy, the city being too busy to hate, right? And clearly, there's a kind of cross-racial political interaction for sure. And yet, this is a Jim Crow Southern city, more moderate than some others, but nonetheless, you had that, you had that legacy, even coming into this period, right? And that, and
I mean,
to see how that plays out moving into the 50s and 60s, I think you do that very well.
Thank you. I mean, despite Atlanta's reputation as being this progressive oasis, I think you could argue there's no figure more associated with massive resistance than Lester Maddox.
That's right.
Coming out of Atlanta, that he's just the clearest manifestation of this. And he builds a huge base without any qualifications, builds a tremendously successful political career, as much as anything about posturing. I mean, in terms of getting actually an agenda done, he really is incredibly unsuccessful as governor, later his term as lieutenant governor. I mean, I think in many ways the symbolic politics one sees in the presence kind of come out of what one sees with Lester Maddox, that it's, I mean, literally or honestly literally showing the flag kind of thing, that there's this politics built around just having this aggressive resistance to what Maddox and his allies would have seen as outsiders trying to reshape their political life. So it's yeah, I think Atlanta in many ways is ground zero for much of the kind of politics one sees in the present.
Yeah, no doubt. And yet, again, I said this earlier, and I want to come to this point now. One of the things I appreciate about this book is, I think you treat the racial dimensions of this history in a very sophisticated manner. It's very easy to write about the South and kind of, portray this kind of flattened, oppressive structure, even in a case like Atlanta. And you could, really dig deep on a Maddox figure and somebody like that. And yet, the way you're dealing with race in the book, I think is really well done, insofar as you're talking about exclusions, you're talking about urban renewal, and the role that the building of the Atlanta Stadium had in facilitating that in that part of the city. But you're also about Black fans. You're also talking about Black political leaders. And so I want you to say more about, how you tackled, race in this book in the different ways you did, because I think it's one of the attributes that it has.
Well, I think as much as anything, I think the kind of narrative of colorblindness in many ways had emerged in Atlanta by the 1970s, that you had blowhards like Maddox who were still clearly trumpeting explicitly the language of race. But what becomes, as Kevin Cruz talks about in his work, what becomes the new Republican majority in suburban Atlanta isn't explicitly talking about race in the way Maddox or George Wallace or someone like that would. They're finding ways to talk about it in the shadow. So I think in particular, as I looked at, for example, when I talk about Atlanta Stadium, I focus in on quite a bit the conflict between the fan base that is there with the workforce at Atlanta Stadium, which was almost exclusively African-American in low-wage jobs. I mean, many of the neighborhoods that get basically destroyed to build the stadium are predominantly African-American neighborhoods. You took a lot of stable working-class neighborhoods and just unmoored them from what had been developed over the course of many decades. So there's that legacy in for many African Americans, particularly in South Atlanta, that this stadium had destroyed, particularly the Summerhill, Bedford Pine neighborhoods, had destroyed many of these neighborhoods surrounding the city. And for many African Americans in these neighborhoods, their primary relationship to these teams and to the stadium is as an employee more so than as a fan. With limited economic opportunities, this is a place nearby with work, not very good paying work, essentially seasonal work, and work that puts you into confrontation with people who politically have voted with their feet that they don't want to live near you. In many respects. It really is, I think, in many ways a source of micropolitics conflict one can see in the stands at Atlanta Stadium during much of this time period.
Yeah, and then when you talk about the other teams, you are attentive to, kind of Black fans, in the story as well, right? Because they are significant. I mean, if they're smaller, certainly, I mean, not demographically, but certainly, in the city itself and the general population, but among the sports fans, there's a really well done analysis of fans, which is actually very hard for the historian to do, right? To kind of figure out what fans were doing or thinking or whatever. And I think you really use your sources very well. Talk about, how the fan base changes with respect to the Hawks and the Falcons.
Well, it changes really with the expansion of Atlanta's Black middle class beginning in the 1970s. Atlanta is one of the cities that most aggressively pursues an affirmative action program, both with municipal employment and also under Maynard Jackson. When Atlanta has a massive airport expansion, they put in a program earmarking a certain number of contracts for African-American contractors, and then dozens of millionaires overnight as a result of this. And the wealth ends up spreading out more broadly and broadly. So as a result, as the tastes of African-American sports fans change in the 60s and 70s, you see a move away from baseball and towards football and basketball becoming the most popular sports. As this population has more discretionary income to choose to go to games, many of them are choosing to go to the Hawks and the Falcons games. And really, that is the savior of those franchises, is the expansion of Atlanta's Black middle class, because the more affluent kind of fan base would have gone to Georgia Tech games on Saturday, then on Sunday going to Atlanta Fulton County Stadium to see the Falcons. They've disappeared by the mid 1970s. It's not the thing to do anymore to go into those games, as the team has failed and failed and failed. The University of Georgia, if anything, becomes the locus of fandom for a lot of people in this region, which I think also reflects the unmooring of people from the city of Atlanta and looking elsewhere for their entertainment. In terms of the Hawks never had an especially strong fan base. Pro basketball wasn't particularly strong in the region, and in Jim Crow Georgia, the Hawks team that shows up, virtually everybody that got any playing time was African American. The fan base didn't embrace this. Also, you have them playing at Georgia Tech, which I mean was for many potential African American fans was an unfamiliar space, was somewhere they weren't going for games regularly. Through the early 1960s, they weren't allowed to go to games at Georgia Tech because it was explicitly segregated. One of the reasons the NFL had such a tough time getting into Atlanta was Georgia Tech had a segregated stadium through 1962, which prevented the early talk of having pro football coming to town. So once you have an expansion of Atlanta's black middle class, you have people that are willing to choose to spend their money on going to these games, whether it's the Falcons or the Hawks. The Hawks during the 80s more broadly get a lot of appeal simply when you have Dominique Wilkins, Spud Webb, Doc Rivers, Mike Fratello, the Air Force One era. It's a very compelling team to watch. But that really proves to be the bread and butter of the Falcons and Hawks fan base. And if you go to either of their games to this day, oftentimes it's a majority African American fan base. I think particularly the Falcons fan base seems to be very, very, very heavily African American in terms of the live audience, just from my experiences attending games in recent years.
It reminds me of New Orleans a lot too. I mean, it's a different context, right? I mean, you don't have the same black middle class in New Orleans for sure, right? But I mean, there is some similar dynamics in the ways in which the fan base, becomes blacker. Certainly, the Saints. There's that very powerful moment at the end of the Spike Lee documentary on the oil spill, in which that's staged, but nonetheless, I mean, even in my time going to New Orleans, I mean, and actually a fascinating game to go to is a Falcons Saints game where you really see the fan bases. You see a significant number of black fans. Absolutely.
I had the first time I went to a Falcons game was at the Georgia Dome. Was a Saints Falcons game, and I was walking around with my notebook trying to find people to interview. That's one of the things I went around looking for people, basically looking for older people to talk to who've been to
yes.
70s, and there was a bus of Saints fans getting off as I was about to cross one of the streets, and the first guy off was a Saints fan who was dressed in a Saints police officer's uniform. It was all Saints things, and it was my time to cross. He blew a whistle, put his hand up, so I stopped at attention, like he was directing traffic, and the whole thing got off, and they all just started laughing and having a great old time with this. They all just started going by and putting their hands up and whistling at me and stuff. It was great.
Yeah, no. I'm sure it was quite a scene. And just to go back to the Hawks real quick, of course, the Hawks, as you discussed, and others have discussed, they signed in 1970, Pete Maravich, right? To become the white star that the white fan base is supposed to like, because they can't get into, the Lou Hudsons and players like that. And yet, Maravich is a failure in Atlanta, and that experiment is a failure also. Why is that, in your view?
I think that it just wasn't a market attuned to basketball. I mean, many of Friday nights, the Hawks got out and drawn by pro wrestling at the city's armory that was built during the Cleveland administration. There'd be 5,000 people hooting and hollering, standing room only crowd to go watch Dusty Rhodes or whomever fight, Bobo Brazil or something fight. Pete Maravich would be playing the most popular basketball player in the country, playing in a brand new arena with plush theater seats. Before that was commonplace. There'd be 3,000 people there, 3,500. It just, for whatever reason, wasn't a basketball marketplace. Even with, I mean, you think about it, they had arguably the most famous baseball player in the country with Hank Aaron, and the most famous basketball player with Pete Maravich at the same time, and both teams were drawing flies. I mean, this was just such a blasé marketplace towards pro sports. And I think as much as anything, it was for this profoundly suburban region, both in terms of just the hassle of getting to downtown Atlanta and a choice of wanting to avoid association with downtown Atlanta. It proved very unsuitable towards having a large mass support towards those teams in those places.
Yeah, you spent a great amount of time talking about the transportation issues, right, and the attempts to make MARTA something that could appeal to the very sectors of the metropolitan region, and how it fails, and of course how it becomes associated with blackness and crime and things like that, right? So your discussion of the buses and the MARTA and the infamous traffic situation in Atlanta is really important. And so Here, so you see the cover of the book. When I saw the cover and I see that the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium is on the cover, I'm thinking, okay, here's going to be another book that's going to rip on the cookie cutter stadium of the 1960s and 70s, and which is something a lot of baseball historians like to do because they view the past stadiums through the lens of the contemporary, bells and whistles, amenity-filled ballparks of today. And yet, your account of these stadiums is, again, more nuanced than I think one usually encounters, certainly talking about facilities of this era. So I want you to talk about, why Atlanta Stadium and the Omni Arena, where that housed the Hawks and the Flames, why did they fail to be the centers of gravity in Atlanta that the civic leaders imagined? Clearly, I think design historians would kind of talk about, how unappealing Atlanta Stadium was as a cookie cutter facility. But that's not, that's part of your analysis, but it's not the brunt of it. Talk about why these stadiums didn't work as these community anchors.
I think in large part was that there was nothing else to draw people around them, that they had sandblasted, thousands of acres of land, plop a couple of stadiums on them, expect people to embrace them. It's just this discrete space of entertainment. There's no civic life built around it. People go to this space, they leave. It's just like the city built all these massive mixed-use developments surrounding the Omni Coliseum is the Omni International Complex, which was one of the largest mixed-use developments in the country. Within 2.5 years, it's the largest real estate bankruptcy in U.S. history. The problem is people would go to them. They would go back 25 miles out to Cobb County or wherever they lived. The idea that people were going to move from one place to another, that these streets were actually going to have any life to them, didn't actually happen in any of these spaces. And I think the stadiums had the same failings that the other large developments in downtown Atlanta did in this time period as well. That they weren't building neighborhood, they were building these basically like Death Stars in the middle of what was formerly a very lively downtown.
Yeah, and yet, that's also part of, much of stadium construction in that suburbanizing period is like that, right? Even, whether it's Shea Stadium here in New York or the Vet, in Philadelphia, in some ways, and the San Diego Stadium as well. The whole notion of having things around a ballpark, that's a pre-60s phenomenon, and that's a post-1990s phenomenon. So in that sense, Atlanta is not that different than some of these other stadiums of that era, right? Or do you think it is different?
No, I think it very much follows the trends that are happening in sports then. I think in the Northeast, even with the Mets, even though they were a new team, they're essentially following a replacement for the Dodgers. Yes. That those teams are building on this existing sense of these teams being a prominent institution in the community that have all of these loyalties. It's not simply a consumer product you're choosing to consume. With Atlanta's teams, that was certainly the case. So this failing in terms of design and development, I think, had a more exaggerated impact there because they couldn't fall back on all of these existing ties that bound people to these spaces and these teams. Yeah, and as much as I ripped on design historians of stadiums, I'm a stadium historian. That's why this is important to me. The Omni was a failure from a design standpoint, right? Absolutely. The roof was a total disaster. Talk about the Omni, and why it failed. Well, it was very poor with the rusty egg crate roof. From very early on, this new design Corten steel was something that had been around since the 1930s, a way that you basically caused a roof to rust on purpose that would make it stronger. For whatever reason, it worked very well in Japan. In Atlanta, with just the continuous heat and humidity that this did, and in the stadium just started rusting and falling apart very quickly. Within 20 years, it seemed like a very old structure. There were lots of stories I heard of horrible things people saw in restrooms with various rodents and insects and all kinds of things invading the space. So the stadium fell apart very quickly. Aesthetically, I think people were a bit far from the action as well, which is certainly true in this era. Atlanta Stadium was much worse in terms of this. It's as a stadium, the best seats for football were in the end zones. Those were the ones closest to the field in terms of design. So I think both stadiums lacked a lot in terms of aesthetics. They were both thrown up fairly quickly. Particularly Atlanta Stadium was done within one calendar year, and it certainly showed. Grime and everything got very built up in the corridors very quickly because they hadn't taken the time to properly sink many of the structures there. But the Omni, I think it aspired to being something particular, like a lot of the buildings of that era, the Great Western Forum, the Spectrum, all of these grandiose names. But I don't think it holds its own historically as a venue. No, certainly even compared to those, absolutely not. So this is
a baseball podcast, that we're on. And you cover the Braves, extensively in this book. But one of the strengths of the book, I would say, is that you don't just talk about baseball, right? To understand what's going on with the Braves, you have to understand what's going on with these other franchises. You have to understand, this broader political context. You have to understand even, the kind of recreational context too. So, talk to me about your decision to spend significant time on these four franchises, right? Including the Flames, which, I'm old enough to sort of remember the Atlanta Flames, I'm 50. So when I was, in the late 70s, when I started becoming aware of sports, I remember the Atlanta Flames, but, you've got a discussion of the Flames in here too. So, I could imagine this is a book that could have focused mostly on even just the Braves and the Falcons, and it would have been fine. But why did you decide to extend beyond those two franchises to talk about, even the Chiefs, the soccer franchise there as well? I mean, they get a brief mention, but, why the multi-sport approach?
Well, I certainly wanted to tell the story in as full a sense as I could. I took very seriously the idea I was talking about other people's lives, people who are oftentimes still alive, and take seriously the experiences they had and the places in which they experienced them. But I guess in a broader sense, I think it's just a personality thing. If I get interested in something, I want to know everything about it. I want to go into all the dimensions of it. I think a part it comes from just my training as a historian, a desire to look at all, whether it's the political or cultural or economic aspects of a story, to just try to figure out all the different parts of it. And originally this was 800 pages, and thankfully the editors cut it down.
It's pretty thick.
Various 50-page yes. It's pretty thick as it is, but the various 50-page digressions on different things in politics and the economy, and there was like another 60 pages on MARTA that I ended up cutting out. But I think in part it's just my mentality. This is 10 years in the making from the time I started my dissertation until the book coming out. And I literally, the day I defended my dissertation, that night I started working on the book proposal, because I knew if I didn't start working on it immediately, it would just sit around for years and years and years. Because I so badly wanted it to not just be a dissertation, to develop it into being a book over time. So it for a decade, it was my preoccupation. It's how I spent my 30s.
I understand. Having spent a long time on book projects myself, I totally get it. And this is even as it originates in a dissertation, it's a very readable book. It's not something that's bogged down in academia. So for the non-academic reader, this would be a very easy book to read and to enjoy. So one of the questions I had, and you addressed this toward the end, but I want to bring it up now. It's to how do you make sense of post 1975 Atlanta sports, right? So I mean, the question here for me is, did Atlanta eventually shed its Loserville image? And how do you account for the transformation in the Atlanta sports scene, during the 1990s and beyond, right? The kind of the renaissance of the Braves, right? The one of the most successful franchises in Major League Baseball in that period, right? Maybe the most successful. The arrival of the Olympics in 1996, the transformation of the Falcons fan base, et cetera. So if Atlanta is Loserville in 1975, is it still Loserville today? And do the transformation of the 90s have something to do with that?
In terms of on-field success, it certainly isn't Loserville anymore. I mean, with the Braves winning a championship. I talk about the University of Georgia a fair amount in the book, because the growth of that, it's in many ways is strongly related to the growth of Atlanta, and they obviously won a national championship. Atlanta United Soccer becoming so popular and winning a championship. The Falcons playing very well for 3 quarters and won Super Bowl. I mean, the Hawks have been very good oftentimes in recent, not so much this year, but the previous season they were very good. So Atlanta's teams have been much more competitive on the field. I think many of the same dynamics still exist in the marketplace. I think in terms of an economic shift, the growth of Atlanta's black middle class has played a profound role in stabilizing the fan bases of these teams. And I think in more of a top-down sense, the ownership has gotten a lot better for Atlanta's teams. If you look at the original ownership groups, they either had novice owners like the Smiths, who ran a very mom-and-pop operation with the Falcons. I will say every single player spoke very highly of them personally. They thought they were great dealing with them one-on-one. Mike Ken, who was the head of the players union for several years, said he was just about the only owner who didn't hold that against the guy who was the team's union rep. So they were on a personal level very, very kind and easy to deal with, but they often relied on personal associates to run the team. The Braves essentially had absentee ownership. It was the Rover boys who owned them for their first 10 years are a group of sons of wealthy Chicago industrialists. You have Tom Cousins, who's basically a real estate guy who owns both the Flames and the Hawks. The Flames are a bit better run. They have Fletcher, who'd been an assistant GM with the Flames running the show, and that's one of the reasons the Flames were so competitive during much of their time in Atlanta. The Hawks go through a lot of different iterations in terms of their management, and certainly showed with a lot of their inconsistency in terms of running the team. Things have certainly changed. I mean, the Hawks have had a little more ownership trouble, and I mean, in recent years they've certainly had some profound controversies with their ownership. But when Turner came in and bought the Hawks, and also Turner buys the Braves, you have a stability for a long period of time with those organizations. The Turner was willing to lose money on both of those teams for many years, simply so he could have inexpensive programming for his TV station. I think he was also much more of a civically minded capitalist than the previous owners, who were guys who simply wanted to own a baseball team. And he was very invested in the idea of that team staying in Atlanta. I think the Braves and the Hawks could well have ended up leaving town without Turner simply shepherding them through the 70s into the 80s into the 90s. With the Falcons, Arthur Blank, who's one of the founders of Home Depot, it brings in a much more stable ownership group than the Smiths were. He buys them from the Smith family in 2002 and runs them essentially the way the other teams in the league are run. I mean, the Falcons have certainly had their ups and downs, but they're much more competitive than they were during the Smiths when they didn't make the NFL playoffs for the first 13 years of their existence, and
1978.
Very poor,
right.
yeah, we're very poor franchise for much of their first 35 years in town. So I think ownership shifts have also played a significant role in terms of the success of those teams. For me, one of the most surprising aspects of the project was how important your owners actually were in terms of your team. That may be less so now as ownership has become more, I guess, corporatized in terms of the way it in terms of the way it runs. A lot of these early Sunbelt owners were basically mom and pop operations like the Smiths. They were people who were wealthy, who may have been very successful in some other business, but I think didn't account for how specific the knowledge one needs to run a pro sports franchise is and to make it succeed. And one certainly saw that in San Diego and Phoenix and some of these other examples as well.
Yeah, no, management matters. I mean, that's something I argued in my Texas book, right? I mean, it made a difference that the Cowboys were run by Tex Ram, and speaking of corporatized, of that era, franchise for sure. But even the San Antonio Spurs, they're unlikely ability to survive in a so-called small market with a heavily working class Mexican American fan base. It's actually astonishing, and it's because of smart management along with the talent of the players, right? So, and yeah, I mean, I read you saying that Turner plays a huge role in saving professional sports in Atlanta, certainly with the Hawks and the Braves, right? And that's a key part. It sounded like, or as I read it, in your analysis to sort of explain the things that transpire afterwards.
Yes, even if the team struggled, Turner, through his, I guess, charisma, through his personality, still gave these teams a sense like they had a momentum. There was something going on with these teams, even if on the field they were no better than they had been previously. The Braves were actually worse for much of the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, finishing in last place on 8 occasions between 1976 and 1990. But by always being on television, by inventing Dale Murphy as a superstar, I would argue he's the first baseball star of the cable television era. I mean, if people have questions about his Hall of Fame credentials, that's the argument I would make. I mean, he is the cable television baseball star. There are more people making the choice to watch him play baseball during the 1980s than any other star, even if his statistics are borderline for Hall of Fame. As a cultural figure, I think he merits induction simply.
There's no question. I'm a New Yorker, so I mean, I was watching as a teenager the Braves. The Braves when they were terrible. Like there's that brief moment in the Tory era of 1982 when they win the division, right? But by the late 80s, I mean, they're terrible. They're horrible, and you're watching them every night in front of 10,000 fans or less. And Atlanta Stadium, so and yet the attendance figures, do spike up in the early 80s, and then certainly again the 1990s when they draw, I think it's in the 93 when they draw 3.8 million fans.
Exactly. Yep.
So so it is interesting to see how the attendance figures eventually do go up, even though you still see a similar kind of apathetic attitude towards the Braves, certainly in the latter parts of their dynasty years.
Yeah, I mean, many times they had playoff games where there'd be 5,000 or 10,000 empty seats. People just got so we'll win the division and then we'll lose to the Marlins or whoever in the divisional playoffs,
or to the Yankees of the World Series.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, also, by the time the 90s were rolling around, you got these multiple rounds of playoffs too. I mean, there's a way in which even you can see how the economics of the sport are actually, playing a role in that process. Because I mean, I think even in the strength of this book is that you do this deep dive in Atlanta, but there are these broader patterns of attendance declines in Major League Baseball in this period, right? Even the teams that are, take the Dodgers out of the equation, even the ones that are finishing, the upper tier of the MLB attendance figures, they're not drawing, much more over between 1 or 2 million people in the 70s, right?
Well, Andy McEwen, his new book about the American League, I watched his pandemic baseball. I haven't read his book yet. I'm looking. I loved his previous book. He was talking about how for the first 10 years the Giants were in San Francisco, they averaged about 1.5 million.
Yep.
When the A's show up in town, collectively the average attendance is 1.7 million between the two franchises.
That's right.
It's just incredible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And so, so there's an interesting, it's certainly in the case of baseball. You do see, just looking at the attendance figures, the way in which it's losing its grip on the American public, especially with the rise of the NFL in that period, and eventually the professional basketball. Do you think in the end, this is a story that this is just an oversaturated sports, market? It reminded me of a great article by Frank Guridy in Sports Illustrated in 1968. It's about Oakland, right? And it's called, great title, City of Complexes, in which he tries to explain, how is it that Oakland winds up with the Raiders, the A's, the California Golden Seals, and the ABA franchise, right? The ABA basketball franchise. And of course, none of these, except for the Raiders, none of these teams are drawing at all, and so, you could see, in that piece, and I kind of see this in the Braves case, that this is just simply a kind of oversaturated market, that 4 teams are coming in within the space of, 6, 7 years or less, and that there's no way to constitute a fan base around these diverse sports, franchises in such a short period of time. Do you think that's true? You've given us a more complicated analysis than that, but some of this is just about oversaturation.
Oh, absolutely. It was just too much to digest. In 6 years, you get 4 teams. And it's not like people weren't interested in sports beforehand. I focus on that a lot in the book, that people, whether it was college football, whether it was 10 different high school games drawing 10,000 people every Friday night in Fulton County, whether it's people going boating in the many lakes in the region, whether it's golf, whether it's tennis, whether it's pro wrestling, whether it's stock car racing, which had many events that drew over 100,000 people in the state every year, not to mention dozens of dirt tracks that drew thousands of people every week. People in a wide range of demographics had a wide range of sporting interests, both as spectators and participants, and the big leagues, for many of them, simply didn't fit into it. And that's not just true of the natives to the region. It's also true of the transplants too, who oftentimes embraced the local passions at the expense of the new pro sports teams. I think that's particularly interesting with stock car racing. That there's lots of people who would have never possibly watched stock car racing that in suburban Atlanta by the 80s, 90s are watching this on a very regular basis, and the numbers on ESPN are incredible for stock car racing as it becomes much more corporate in its feel and appeal during this era.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, and again, the role of college and high school sports, as these established institutions, before the arrival of these pro teams, something I talked about in the Texas book, is also a factor here, as you alluded to, with Georgia and certainly Georgia Tech, right? Certainly with football, no question, right? The ways in which, there's this master narrative with the Dallas Cowboys of it being this popular team, but it takes them a while to kind of break into the Dallas market. They have to contend with the Dallas Texans, who eventually leave and become the Kansas City Chiefs. They have to contend with SMU football, right? Which, was mediocre, but also pretty good. Not to mention the robust high school scene, right? So, even the attendance figures in those cases, are kind of, even a supposed football mad, Texas sometimes are really surprising, and so, this is a great, story of, that really shows that the ways in which professional sports teams succeed is not an inevitable process. It really is required. There are all these contingent factors that make it work, right? And here's the story. And you're saying in other cases like Phoenix and San Diego and other Sunbelt cities, where you still have these teams there, but one wonders why they've lasted so long. In some ways you're making this case, as you say at the end of the book, on the last page. You say, in each instance, the cluster of professional sports franchises that settled in a Sunbelt city failed to live up to the local elite's expectations. The tendency of cities to acquire several teams in succession left markets oversaturated long before any one of the teams developed a steady fan base, right? So that this is a kind of dynamic you're seeing throughout the Sunbelt. And yet, the Arizona Diamondbacks still around, the Phoenix Cardinals, or I think that's what they're called, are still around in Glendale, wherever they play in that stadium. But then you have San Diego, which they've lost their franchise. Certainly, they lost their NFL franchise. Now I have the Padres left, right? Not to mention the NBA, which failed in San Diego. So there is this kind of history of failure here that you're seeing throughout the region. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. And it seems like the marketplaces in the South and West more broadly that did well got one team, took time to embrace them. I mean, if you look at Phoenix, the Suns did incredibly well there
Yes.
because they were by themselves for a long time, built up a very strong base of support. The Utah Jazz did very well on their own. Portland Trailblazers, San Antonio Spurs are on their the NBA seemed to do that very well. Take these underserved marketplaces in terms of sports and just make them a local institution. Those teams have a local appeal that radically outstrips all of the other franchises that end up coming into a lot of these places very quickly. I mean, Phoenix got three other teams very quickly in the late 80s and early 90s. None of them have the local historical reputation of the Suns, who were almost always good, where Jerry Colangelo was very good at continuously fielding an attractive team, having a very family-friendly oriented, family-friendly environment that ended up drawing. I mean, they were very focused on building that kind of appeal, having tons of giveaways. It seems like in many ways, though, that cluster of NBA teams is the model for how to be an expansion franchise.
That's exactly right. I mean, the 1990s is another oversaturation period where these, the Coyotes are showing up, and another NHL franchise shows up in Atlanta, the Thrashers, and you're seeing this glut of of teams and also of stadium construction, right? As the kind of multi-purpose stadium, goes away in baseball and football, and they all have their own facilities, right? And so, I mean, and that's the dynamic you have really to this day, kind of an oversaturated market in a lot of these places. I think.
Absolutely. And it's only going to get worse. I mean, because there's more and more cities that want these franchises. The leagues have them as long as they have this monopoly status. They're going to leverage cities against each other. I think that's another important aspect of this book, that Atlanta in many ways helps create the arms race among cities, that they show the path that other cities can take if they want to get teams. Go out there, say, hey, we're open for business. And it puts older, Philly or Cleveland or Detroit, puts them in a very bad position, having lots of other civic things that merit that money a lot more than stadiums, feel like they have to make these investments to keep their teams, keep very long tenured local institutions. So I think in a broader sense, it had a very negative impact on a lot of other cities.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I argued about with the Astrodome. I mean, the Astrodome in Houston, Atlanta, built as kind of vanilla, boring, cookie cutter stadium, but the Astrodome, really, raises the game in terms of the amenity stadium with the luxury boxes and all the bells and whistles, right? So it really contributes to this kind of arms race mentality in terms of stadium design, right? And that stayed with us to this day. And here we are in a place like New York, right? State of New York just handed over the Buffalo Bills, billions of dollars to build a new stadium for the Bills. I mean, it's astonishing how this dynamic just persists, even when you think, and there are these moments like in California with Los Angeles and some of these cities are pushing back and are not bringing the NFL in. It takes a long time for the NFL to come back to Los Angeles for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I think
San Diego, right? So, and yet
they just said no, we're not going
to do it. Yeah, and I mean, at least to the Atlanta mayor's credit, when the Braves in 2013 said they're going to Cobb County, the mayor was like, "Bye, go," for the most part, right? Yeah. So,
I think Kasim Reed did an excellent job both with the Thrashers too.
That's right.
My electorate in the city of Atlanta is not the ones going to the Thrashers games.
That's exactly right.
Thrashers want money. Somebody in the suburbs can build that stadium. Somebody in another city. We have much more significant priorities than this. I think one thing that I admired in subsequent decades with Atlanta's political leadership was the pragmatism that they ended up developing towards this. Once you had the black electoral majority in the city, you saw whether it was Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, Bill Campbell, all the way to Kasim Reed, looking what benefit will this have to my core constituency, and I wish more leaders in more cities had this clear-eyed approach to it, that there's no punches pulled about this. Is this going to benefit them, my constituency, directly, or is it going to just have this ethereal kind of relationship to my city?
Yeah, and that is interesting considering the politics that went into the building of the Georgia Dome and then the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, right, which involved the destruction of Black institutions, right? I mean, through a negotiation, of course, not an urban renewal project like what happened with Atlanta Stadium. So yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's why this case is so interesting. And I want to suggest, as I continue to tout your book, that this is an outstanding analysis of racial politics in American cities. It really is, because I mean, you're able to kind of see, the role of Black elected officials. You're able to see the kind of complicated politics that enable stadiums to be built, the kind of deals that are made, and and the limits of Black political power too, right? So in a suburbanizing context, as a former Jim Crow city, and the way you're able to weave those together in this book, I think, is really, really well done.
Thank you.
Well, so we could keep talking about this all night, but I probably should draw this to a close. So congratulations, Clayton, on this outstanding book, Loserville: How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. It was a real pleasure to read it and a pleasure to talk to you tonight. And I urge all of our watchers and listeners to buy this book. They will learn a lot about, contemporary and historical, politics around sports and urban development. Congrats, Clayton. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thanks. It was a pleasure for me as well. I hope you have a great evening.
You too.